Just continuing on, the group's Métis Settlement General Council is also looking for more time before they come and join us. And the Métis Nation of Alberta Association has chosen to make a written submission for Phase 1. And of course, we're happy to accommodate those requests. Because of these late cancellations, we've decided that we need to cancel the second portion of this week's meeting that was originally scheduled for tomorrow morning. I will work with the Secretariat to review our work plan and ensure that our meeting schedule for Phase 1 will have enough time to continue to cover everything that we still need to accomplish. Your e-binder distributed for this meeting will include responses to the panel requests for information that were received on February 15th. There is one last information request intake window for Phase 1 that will include information requests received after February 15th and others up to the closing date of March 14th, 2017. This will allow the Secretariat to get us the information prior to our final deliberations on recommendations. As you're aware, the throne speech on March 2nd included a message to Albertans that new legislation focused on ensuring child death reviews received the utmost care and attention. This provides us with a timely way to move the panel's work on improving the child death review process forward. So, any additions to the agenda this evening or any changes? Is everyone good with our plan?
I've got
a
list of questions again. I'll pass around if that's okay, Chair.
Sure.
Because I know that it's we need to share question asking time, and we're just trying to accommodate the schedule that's been established. So.
And I've just received a note that the next meeting is actually scheduled for March 16th, which happens to be Budget Day. So we're going to see if we can move it, because I have a feeling that may be not utmost. Everybody's going to be busy elsewhere. So we will keep you posted on what we're able to change. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So today we're going to gain some clarity and have the opportunity to address many of the panel's questions on the subject of sharing information across systems and services. At the February 28th meeting, the panel's afternoon was spent in an interactive facilitated process to reflect on the information received to date and identify key issues for the panel to consider. Today's facilitated process will build on last week's discussions and provide us with more opportunity to validate the report back from last week and begin refining the issues. Joining Damien to assist with the facilitation is his colleague from Culture, Lisa Talavia Spencer. Hopefully I said that correctly. As we heard last week, this facilitated process is designed to help us move towards converging our ideas and strive for consensus as a panel in our recommendations to improve the child death review process. And we will then close our day with a brief discussion of the agenda for the next meeting. So I would now like to invite a presentation, the Executive Director of Knowledge and Information Management, George Alvarez, and Joni Brodziak, the Executive Director from Child Intervention. George has been with the Government of Alberta for over 30 years and is currently the Executive Director of Knowledge and Information Management for Children's Services. That is a mouthful. Part of his role since its inception in 2011 is leading the information sharing strategy in collaboration with government ministries, frontline service providers, and non-government organizations across the social services sector. Prior to this role, George had been the Director of the Information and Privacy Office for Human Services since 1997 and was responsible for the provision of privacy-related services to some 80 public bodies across 4 ministries. Joni Brodziak will co-present with George in her role as Executive Director of Policy Practice and Policy Development, Child Intervention. Joni has hands-on experience with the opportunities and challenges for sharing of information. The intent of this presentation is for panel members to understand how information sharing works in the child intervention system, as well as within the child death review process. George and Joni have included in their presentation an overview of the legislation that governs these policies and procedures. Panel members can expect a comprehensive picture of the benefits of current information sharing policies, as well as insight into what barriers privacy and information sharing, in its many forms and interpretations, may cause when child intervention is striving for the best outcomes for children. Take it away, George and Joni.
Thank you. Thank you, honourable members of the panel and guests. I welcome the opportunity to be able to present for you a bit of the overview of what it has that we've been doing for the last number of years in regards to the sharing of information or the flow of information What I plan to speak on today is, first of all, to provide a bit of an overview as to the strategy itself, the information sharing work that we've been doing for the last number of years. And when I talk about information sharing, really I'm talking about the collection, use, and disclosure as it's better known when you're talking privacy legislation speak. As well, I want to speak a bit about the legislative framework, because it's not just privacy legislation that we have to consider. We have to consider that in conjunction with all of the other legislation that, that we also adhere to. And then finally, I want to talk about how it is that these pieces of legislation and the information sharing process itself, how they work together to support the better work that is done by child intervention, by children's services, and all of the associated pieces that go along with that, of course, including the reporting and review of critical incidents and deaths of children in care. And then, of course, open it up for questions. So I'll start with an overview of what information sharing is. First of all, it was developed in recognition that people were having across the social service sector, and that means both inside and outside of government. And by the social sector, I'm talking about not only social service departments such as children's services and community and social services, but it also includes education, the health sector, and all of those real people-facing ministries or sectors. What we were finding was that people were needing to work together but not feeling comfortable that they could share information that was necessary in order to do that, in order to support the clients that they had, that they have either in common or that they're working in a collaborative manner around. That often leads to duplication. It often leads to people working at cross purposes. And what we also found was that it's also driven quite often because of people not understanding how to apply the legislation. They were afraid of making mistakes, maybe afraid of getting in trouble, and, and finding that sometimes it's easier just to say no than to try to figure it out. So we needed to address that. And as we started down that road, we started recognizing that there are things that we can do to remove some of those impediments. One of those things that we did early on was take a look at the introduction and implementation, supported that implementation of the Children First Act. And I'll get a little bit more into the Children First Act later on. But one of the things that it did was provide some of the clarity that people were requiring. Should note as well that as we've been developing and implementing the strategy, one of the things that we observe, there's a lot of patterns that emerge. And we find that there's often similar groups of organizations that require the same type of information in order to provide for the same types of outcomes for the same types of clients, the same types of demographic sectors. When we look at that, then it becomes easier to identify how it is that they need to work together, the type of information that is okay and necessary to share and that is authorized to be shared, and the things that they shouldn't be doing or shouldn't be sharing. By doing that, by looking at these what we call collaborative service clusters, it allows us to be a little bit broader in terms of how we approach the questions and the issues and then provide better supports for the outcomes. When I think about the number of review processes that take place when there's a child who is deceased and the review processes, investigative processes and so forth, that may be one of those areas that we need to do a deeper dive on. Are there areas within that might be able to be made more efficient or effective? I do want to say as well that information sharing, it's not an end into itself. So it's not that we just want to be able to share information. Really, it's all about how do we improve services to Albertans, how do we ensure that the organizations that do need to work together in a collaborative or in an integrated manner, that they get the right information in order to provide that right service. It's not the flip side of privacy, but rather it needs to strike a balance of a number of sometimes what are seen to be competing interests. So we need to be able to look at balancing the need to manage information in a way that not only honors the intent and the word of the privacy legislation, but in a way that also meets the best interests of Albertans. And when you take a look at the diagram there's a number of things there that we have to balance. We also have to look at ensuring that the societal interests are being met and that we don't push people away from services. What I mean by that, I'll give you an example to maybe provide some context. In the past, we've had situations where, as you know, under the Enhancement Act, there's a requirement for professionals to support when they suspect a child being abused. And we've had situations in the past where, for example, if somebody phones HealthLink, I'm sure everybody's familiar with HealthLink, provided great service in terms of triaging and being able to identify some of the issues and perhaps the direction that the individual calling in should follow from a medical perspective when they have some medical concerns. Well, as they do that, sometimes, because they are so good at triage, they identify that maybe the child that the person phoning in is talking about, maybe the injuries are the result of abuse. And so they have an obligation to report that abuse. So they will phone, they will connect with our staff, our department, and report that abuse. But what was happening at times was that the information that they would provide was just little nuggets. There was not enough for us to really work from. So we met with them and talked about, so what's going on here? And what we found was that, well, there's a couple of reasons I think that were behind that. One of them is that they are subject to the Health Information Act, and under that piece of legislation, they've been told that they have to give as little amount of information as is needed in as anonymous way as possible in order to continue to meet the requirements under that legislation. The other thing, though, that we see not only here but in many of the other investigative processes is that they didn't want to chase people away. So they didn't want to give us information about what's going on, what they think is going on, and then we show up at the doorstep and say to them, hi, we're here from Children's Services, we're here to take your kid away because we received a report that you're abusing your child from HealthLink. It's not how we work, but they don't know how we work. If we don't have a conversation with them, how are they expected to know? So when we describe the process, we gather other information. We gather information in a way that we can look at whether or not there's other collateral supports for that type of, for the issues. We do not release the name of the reporter. And by being able to identify the process that we use, they started to feel more comfortable. The first piece that I spoke to, though, I'll get into a bit more detail later on, but it's how we interpret legislation. So just because it's in as anonymous a way as possible doesn't mean that you never identify the individual that you're talking about. And sometimes you have to do that in order for the work to go forward. So as we're looking at the whole thrust of the information sharing, the work that we're doing, it really is meant to support a lot of the shifts that are taking place in the way that government operates right now. We're moving towards a client-centered approach instead of a program-centered approach, meaning that we're taking a look at what are the service needs, what are the services that meet the needs of individuals, rather than trying to fit them into a program. We have to be able to take a look at how we do that together. That means that we have to be embracing collaboration, enabling the integration of services where required. That recognizes that we have a shared responsibility in meeting the needs of Albertans. And in order to be able to do anything with that shared responsibility, we have to work together. We can't work together if we don't talk to each other. We can't talk to each other if we can't share information. So it becomes very important. That's not to say that we're talking about opening all of our files to everyone. It's not at all the case. It's more taking a look at what is the information that is necessary to support the outcomes that we're identifying when we work together in a comprehensive or coordinated case management approach with the client involved as much as possible within that. And then being able to very clearly identify to the clients, to the Albertans that we're working with, how that works, how the information that we're asking for is going to be tied to the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. It's recognizing something that even though we work in government and understand that there's a lot of different organizations in government, most people probably don't. Most people probably don't think about Government of Alberta as being a number of different organizations, different departments, different agencies. They think that we work together. And really this is recognizing that we have to work together in order to reach these better outcomes. It also allows us to be more efficient, more effective. And so one of the things that we're moving towards more is collecting the information once and using it where we can to provide those services that Albertans need. So when we started this, the plan was that we would start out with 3 ministries. Easy. We had Human Services, Education, and Health as the starting point. Well, if you take a look at that, it's not just the ministries themselves, it's also their stakeholders. There's 100,000 people working for Alberta Health Services. There's 40,000 teachers. in the education sector. We have thousands of staff. We have many agencies that we contract with. So it's a fairly large piece of that human service or that social service sector. And the intent was originally we would start with those three ministries and their stakeholders and then expand it to the rest of the government, especially in the human service sector. But what we found, of course, is that change takes time. It's become very iterative in terms of the approach. And so we've been slowly expanding, rather than going through the phases that we thought we would. We've been slowly expanding to increase the membership. And so currently, the ministries that you see identified here, Alberta Health, Education, Children's Services and Community Social Services, Seniors and Justice are the ministries that are participating in this and the implementation, as well as Service Alberta as one of the support areas, and being responsible for FOIP, of course, they have a stake in this. The work that we're doing is, again, not just for the ministries, but it's also all of the service provider organizations that they work with, our stakeholders. And while we've always worked across sectors, we recognize that it's been a fractured approach. And when privacy legislation came in, it didn't do a great service in terms of cohesively addressing the things that need to be addressed. So part of what we're trying to achieve then is really getting people to understand and how to apply the legislation in a way that does allow for that better service approach. It is taking a look at some fairly significant cultural shifts, if you will. We're moving from a you can share, which is what we've always said, to a you will share the information that is necessary to support those outcomes that we're trying to identify through that coordinated case management approach. We're moving from a risk-averse environment where we're afraid only of liability issues to one where we need to manage risk properly. And there's a lot of different risks that come into play. There's risks of not doing the right thing. There is a risk associated to health and safety issues. There is a risk of not being able to achieve the outcomes that we really do need to achieve when we're working with Albertans. We are as accountable for what we don't share as for what we do share. And that has to be part of what people's understanding encompasses. We also need to enable the flow of information so that people don't have to continually repeat their stories. And we also have to make sure that staff that are working with the clients, that we delegate the decision making as close to them as possible, if not with them directly, in order that, because they're the ones that are in the best position to see what are the implications of the decisions that they're making. Of course, that has to happen with the support of their managers, their supervisors, and the various training and other resources that we can make available to them. So as we think about that, what does that mean? Well, we work in a very legislated environment. And the interpretation and application of legislation is often undertaken in a very narrow and sometimes very literal approach, as that example about HealthLink has given. And that's not always appropriate. We need to take a longer view, and we need to take a look at what are the intended purposes of the information. Quite often when we think about gathering information, we think about just the symptom we're trying to deal with and not taking that long view. We need to do a better job than that. And the legislation does allow us to do that. So for example, if you think about somebody who's got a disability, we've got many programs that support people with disabilities, starting from when they're a child or a youth. We have the Family Supports for Children with Disabilities program, and we assist people with disabilities, but they have to prove that they have a disability in order to get that assistance under that program. Well, when they turn 18, there's other programs that they can apply for. They could apply for persons with developmental disabilities. They could apply for the assured income for the severely handicapped. Maybe they need a public guardian or a public trustee, and so there's an application process that leads to that. As well, there are other income support programs that might be of benefit to them for those maybe who can work to some degree, or those who have barriers to employment. And every one of those programs asks them to prove again that they're disabled. Doesn't make a lot of sense when you think about it, and especially when we're talking about managing that within a ministry or two. So part of what we're looking at then is that broader view. If someone is disabled, let's accept that they're disabled, because that's not going to change in life. The things that, the supports that might be available to them might change, but not the other things. Same is often true of assessments. Many of those same programs and other programs require people to go through an assessment process so we can identify what are their strengths, what are their skills, what are their abilities, what are the gaps, and how can we better assist and identify those things that can support them moving forward. But if we're going to make them go through an assessment for each one of those programs, those assessments start to lose some of their validity. In fact, there are assessments that should not be done more frequently than every 2 or 3 years. So we need to take a look at then how do we capture those assessments and move them to the areas that require them or allow decisions to be made on them so that they don't have to be continually repeated. We also have to take a look at the impacts of legislation as a whole when we're working with other program areas. And there's principles that start to be applied. We often get asked when we're talking about information sharing, is that open data? It isn't, not specifically, but the principles are the same. And we like to think about there being a bit of a continuum or spectrum of information. So at the one end, we've got the use of identifying information, both personal and health information, for the purposes of service delivery. We need to collect information in order to provide the services. At the other end of the spectrum, we do have the open data supported by open government, and that's where we can push information out for public consumption. And that information, typically, the true definition is that it's raw data. But we can't put out raw data about identifying information about individuals. So we can put out statistics, we can put out some numbers and roll-ups of things. We also can provide reports that have been done as a result of population trend analysis. And some of the work that you're looking at here probably fits within some of that. How do we satisfy ensuring that the public has an ability to take a look at what is going on in terms of trends, and at the same time we still have the personal information that we need for the service delivery. In the middle, there is another piece, and that's where we do need sometimes to link information together, administrative information about the individuals we provide services to. We need to link that at an identifying level. For example, if we are going to provide some services that are integrated across multiple organizations, then we have to be able to take a look at what are the cumulative impacts of that integration, and that means linking the data so that we can identify, is there a decrease in the recidivism of individuals accessing emergency services by putting in place, for example, subsidized housing and being able to meet some of the social demands. If so, then that has to be linked, but the reporting and the analysis of that tends to be done at a population level. However, we do need that information for a number of reasons. We have accountability measures. We have to be able to determine whether or not the outcomes we've identified are being met. We have to be able to report on those outcomes. Are there gaps? Are there things that we're missing? All of those pieces have to require that use of that information. And so the approach that we're talking about really does have broader uses than simply delivering that service to the individual Albertan or their family. So let's get a little bit into the legislation. And I know that I'm speaking to people who are very familiar with legislation, but I want to give some context around this. The FOIP Act. There's 34 subclauses in the FOIP Act that deal with disclosure. So under Section 40, there's 34 reasons why we can disclose information. So it's fairly far-reaching in terms of the things that we can do. And if we can't do it under that, there's probably a reason for that. On the other hand, the Health Information Act is not as broad from that perspective, but there are clauses within the Health Information Act as well that do allow us to more effectively work together. When we're looking at all of this legislation, it isn't just the privacy legislation that we have to look at. There's relationships between legislation that exist, and sometimes you have to rely on different pieces of legislation in order to do the things that we need to do. And so part of what we're looking at is trying to identify that roadmap for people so that they can feel comfortable in making the right decisions. But ultimately, the frameworks that we develop need to be seen as a basket of supports for the staff to provide the services to the clients that we're serving. The privacy environment or landscape in Alberta is pretty complex, and in front of you, you've got a number of pieces of privacy legislation. So we start out with the FOIP Act, and it applies to public bodies. Children's Services, of course, is a public body. But Children's Services doesn't work by itself. It works with many other organizations. And some of those organizations are not subject to FOIP, they're subject to other pieces of legislation. In FOIP, we do have a clause that allows public bodies to share information or disclose information if they're involved in a common program or an integrated service with another public body. And that certainly opens the door to a lot of the work that we're describing here. However, the Health Information Act does not contain such a provision. And so we can't use that necessarily within that sector, at least from that perspective. On the other hand, the Health Information Act does contain a provision that allows for the disclosure of health information to someone who's responsible for the ongoing treatment and care of an individual. When that section was first discussed, there were many that felt, especially in the health sector, that really that still means sharing information with people who are in the health sector. But you don't need that if you're in the health sector because you're already captured under the other provisions of the Act. So when we clarified with health and with our legal teams that it was meant to be broader than that, that started to open the door as well, at least to lead to a greater understanding about how it is that health information can be shared. It means that if necessary, health information about an individual student in a school can be shared with a school if they need it for the work that they're doing with that student. It means that a foster parent or a foster family can have the information provided to them from the health information again if they require it, or a social worker and so on. So it does mean that we have to not only look at the legislation that we are under, but then how is the legislation that other organizations we work with being interpreted, and then how can we work better to address a common interpretation, if you will. The Health Information Act, of course, applies to Alberta Health Services, to health practitioners as they're being pulled in under the regulation changes. The Personal Information Protection Act applies to the private sector, although it doesn't at this point include the not-for-profit sector within that. And then, of course, we have the Federal Privacy Act, and we have to be aware of that because many of our partners, some of our partners are subject to that. The RCMP, Canada Revenue, Employment and Social Development Canada, amongst others, that we do work with in a number of areas. However, getting back to the not-for-profit sector, we work quite a bit in children's services with agencies that are not-for-profit agencies, and they're not subject to any privacy legislation. What that means then is that we have to be careful about our contracting and the agreements that we enter into with them so that we ensure that the accountability around the management of information is entrenched within the contract language, because we can't assume accountability otherwise. And I'll give you an example that might help illustrate how complicated it is for some. So I can think about a large organization, could be Catholic Social Services or some other agency. They're a fairly robust organization. They are in the province, across the province, and they provide services across the province. There are contracts that are entered into that allow them to be somewhat pulled under the umbrella of FOIP, because we have to be accountable in how the information that they're charged with being responsible for in the delivery of the services are, we maintain our accountability under FOIP through that process. If they contract with Alberta Health Services or another health provider, a health custodian, then they get pulled under the umbrella of the Health Information Act in the same way. And if they were to contract with somebody in the federal government, the same thing happens there. However, they are not, as an organization, subject to the Personal Information Protection Act, except, and there's always the exceptions, isn't there? If they are providing an activity that is a commercial activity that involves the collection and management of personal information, that activity is subject to the Personal Information Protection Act. So if they, for example, provide counseling on a sliding fee scale, it's now a commercial activity and that piece of it gets captured. So they're going to be subject through the contract to FOIP. Doesn't mean that that FOIP applies directly, though, to HIA, the Health Information Act, to perhaps the Privacy Act, and if they do that commercial activity, then part of them is subject to the Personal Information Protection Act. So if they're a robust organization, they've got teams of lawyers can figure that out. But many of the organizations that we work with are smaller and don't have that same level of sophistication or understanding or capacity to get there if we don't assist them. Now, when I look at, when we consider privacy legislation in general, there are some commonalities. They all speak to identifying the authority to do things. The collection, use, and disclosure provisions, they exist in all privacy legislation, although they do vary depending on the individual act. There are similar constructs, however. The collection is much broader under the FOIP Act than it is under the Health Information Act. At least the disclosure of some of the information that they collect. It speaks to use. So what are the purposes that are allowed for under the different pieces of legislation? And it also speaks to disclosure. What information can be disclosed with or without consent? There are some common provisions within that. So when we take a look at the disclosure provisions, health and safety exists in all privacy legislation. There's always that out clause if there's a need to provide information because of a health or safety concern. However, sometimes the bar is set pretty high. When the FOIP Act and the Health Information Act were first developed, the provision around health and safety was that imminent harm that there had to be a risk of imminent harm before you could disclose. And that was being interpreted by many organizations fairly strictly, meaning essentially that the person's facing grave bodily harm or death kind of right now. In many situations, that's not the case. The person enters a hospital, for example, they're now in a safe place. As soon as they leave, they may be back in harm's way, especially in many of the situations that we work with, but for now they were in a safe place. So when the Children First Act was brought in, that's one of the things that we addressed, and there were changes that were made under the legislation to some of the miscellaneous statutes that changed the provisions within the FOIP Act and the Health Information Act as it relates to minors. And now the bar has been set lower, so it's where there is a reasonable expectation of harm, then that information can be provided. They also speak to other things such as consent, and all of the legislation also contains a clause that allows for disclosure where other legislation authorizes that collection or the disclosure. And that becomes important when we look at that framework of legislation. The Children First Act I've mentioned a couple of times, and it's based on a philosophy that programs and services that support children are most effective when they are provided through a collaborative or multidisciplinary approach. And that collaboration can only be truly effective when the appropriate information sharing occurs between the organizations. Now, in this legislation, it speaks to very specific service providers, being police services as defined under the Police Act. And that becomes important, as I'll highlight, to school authorities as defined under the FOIP Act, to government departments, and to custodians under the Health Information Act. So it provided more clarity, even though there was already the ability to share information between those organizations. What it allowed for is better clarity around the information that can be shared. For the Children's Services Department, however, they don't rely as much on this because those provisions are already embedded within the Enhancement Act. However, again, Children's Services works with a lot of other organizations that are not necessarily subject to the Enhancement Act. Another important point to note here is that staff often work from their own legislative perspective or within their own legislative environment or from a policy and practice. Not everybody works always with legislation in mind. Probably the child intervention staff are ones that do more so than any other area. But many of the organizations or other program areas work more from a policy and practice perspective. And that then behooves us, the people that do some of the policy work and policy development, is to ensure that the practices and procedures that ensue from that are comprehensive enough to capture the inputs from this other legislation reviews. We need to understand the constraints that people operate under as well. The other legislation that's listed there, and these are just examples, some of it is pretty specific in terms of the information flow or information sharing clauses. The Enhancement Act, for example, is pretty clear as to when it is that information can and cannot be shared. However, in others, again, such as the Police Act, legislation defines the organizations that are subject to it, speaks a little bit about the management of the means by which they might be managed, but is silent on the flow of information. So that means having to rely on other areas, other legislation, such as omnibus legislation like the FOIP Act. Police services are individually public bodies. They also are subject to the Children First Act. And when you take a look at the Police Act, there's a clause there that allows us, as a government, to enter into an agreement with the RCMP or whomever to deliver police services, and that's what has happened. So that pulls the RCMP under the Police Act, and therefore pulls the RCMP under the Children First Act. You need to take a look sometimes at those different connections in order to see how they are, in fact, able to rely on things like the Children First Act. The legislation, both the program legislation and the privacy legislation, creates a framework that many of the organizations that we work with end up being involved in. And there's an attachment that went with your binder today that outlines some of the specific legislative provisions that speak to the different organizations and the, especially the review bodies that you're taking a look at. Some of this builds on stuff that you already have before you. So some of that has been provided to you in different formats, but when we take a look at how legislation addresses the ability of these reviews to take place, becomes important to understand. The Enhancement Act, as an example, authorizes the Council for Quality Assurance and the reviews that they take place, and any subsequent expert panel if there's a need for that. As well, allows for the director to designate an individual to conduct a review. It also requires reporting to other organizations so that they can undertake the reviews that are necessary. And for Children's Services, the Enhancement Act really is a center point of how they operate, and it allows or requires all of those processes, enables all of those processes to take place, including reporting to the offices of the Child and Youth Advocate and the Chief Medical Examiner. And as we look at some of the other legislation, you'll see that it might articulate or authorize the ability for those panels or those organizations to access information in order to do the work that they do. Some of the processes also start to identify the need to review what's being done by others. And you'll also note that the privacy legislation, as I mentioned earlier, also allows for all of the disclosures that take place under this legislation, the program legislation, because there is that provision that allows for where another piece of legislation authorizes it. So this next slide you're going to recognize. It's already been presented to you, and I think was the subject of some conversations and scenarios. And it identifies a variety of review processes that take place. So what we've done here is now taken that same slide and layered on top of it the legislation that actually authorizes those different review bodies to do the work that they're doing. So on the left side, for example, under the Child Intervention Division now, the provisions that allow for both the Council for Quality Assurance and for the Director's own review, as well as the need to report to the OC, to the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate and the Chief Medical Examiner are identified there. And that goes with all of those organizations that were identified there. So now we're going to pass it over to Joni, and she's going to talk to a little bit about the the document flow.
Thanks, George. I always learn a bit more every time I listen to him. He's a wealth of information. So we took a look at the questions that have come from panel members as it relates to information sharing, and tried to think about how we could address some of those through what George talked about in relation to where we've been with information sharing and sort of where we're going. But I also wanted to circle back at a real, like, on the ground level, what does information sharing really look like? And we'll start sort of at a case level. So George referenced that the Child, Youth and Family Enhancement Act has some clauses that are fairly explicit in terms of information sharing, and they generally revolve around what we call Section 126, which is the best interest test for information sharing. We understand that we don't work in isolation, that we work with parents and we work with communities, and kids go to schools and they go to hospitals. And so we do need to have some authority to be able to provide information and receive information in order to provide services. So at very early point in time of our involvement, when we receive a call expressing a concern for a child, we may actually start the information sharing process right then. And what we would typically do is call what we would consider collateral. So does this child go to a daycare? Does this child go to school? What's the nature of the concern being reported? Who might have information that could help us either substantiate the need for further investigation or suggest that the concerns that were expressed by the caller may not be valid. When we do open a file with the child and their family, we also need to be able to communicate with service providers and communities, not only contracted agencies, but other community agencies, home visitation as an example, a parent link center, the kinds of services that might be supporting a family meet their child's needs. When that child is actually in our care, whether or not we're the custodian or the guardian, we also have the same kinds of obligations that a parent would have as it relates to needing to fill out forms to go on field trips with allergy. What are they allergic to, and what kinds of food can they have, and what is their Alberta healthcare number? As well as work with other healthcare providers, be it pediatrician or family doctors, those kinds of bodies. We also work with the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate in their individual advocacy, so share information back and forth with them as it relates to decision making that's happening on files. I think one of the things that we wanted to point out, and George is very eloquent in not is that can we share, but we should share. And that is, there's no doubt about that. Having said that, some of the risk aversion around sharing information also comes from a bit of a principle base that I think is important to point out. Elder Auger talked about doing the right things, but doing the right things in a good way. And I couldn't agree more. People's personal information is pretty precious cargo. And so while we can share information and we should share information, we should be fairly open with the people's whose information it is about who we're sharing it with and for what purpose. That's just a principled approach to working with people. So that if your doctor is going to share information with another service provider, you should know that that information is being shared. It's in your best interest, but here's why we're doing it. There are two pieces of information we don't share at all. And one is the name of a reporter. The name of a reporter, so if somebody calls in expressing concern for a child, that information is actually legally protected, and that information is generally only released through a court order. That protection has been put in place so that people feel unencumbered to report a concern of child abuse and neglect. The second pieces of information that aren't shared with anybody are any documentation that relates to our engagement with legal counsel, so legal advice to the director. We do have several of our legal authorities happen through a court process, and so we are generally represented there by legal counsel. Any of those discussions, just like any other Albertan or anybody in North America who has conversations with their legal counsel, that information is privileged and protected and isn't shared. I'm going to take us now to sort of a system level as it relates to the contemplations the panel is having right now on child death, on the review of deaths and serious incidents. So we use Section 126 to enable the broader information sharing to review bodies, as well as other provisions in other legislation that George referenced. What I want to make clear right now, so that there's no confusion, is both provincial service delivery and delegated First Nations agency are subject to the discussion we just had at case level, but also the review process, so sharing of information for the purposes of reviews. We share information for a variety of purposes, including reviews. And one of the places where information sharing comes into play at a broader level is historical police investigations. So a young person may report historical abuse in a prior placement, as an example. In those circumstances, our policing partners may want to know what other children might have been there at the same time for the purposes of undertaking a criminal investigation. We will release information in those circumstances as well, redacting people's third-party information. We share information related to current and historical policy and practice improvements that have been made. So for the purposes of fatality inquiries, most specifically because they may happen several years after a death, so we'll go back in time. We also share information in the anticipation of providing a service. And one of the places that we do, that we have an agreement, and there was a couple of questions about this, which is why I bring it up, is that we share information with policing agencies on an ongoing basis related to two key areas. And one is when a child has to be removed from their family, even on a short term. It's ideal from a child-centered perspective that they can go to somebody that they know, that they're familiar with, possibly family, but possibly neighbor or a coach. So while formal kinship requires a criminal record check in the middle of the night, that's sort of an impossible task. And so we do have the provisions through some role clarification with the policing agencies around being able to do quick short-term checks to ensure that if a child's going to be placed on an emergent basis, it's safe to do so. That doesn't diminish the requirement over the long term to do the formalized criminal record checks. It's a short-term measure to help sort of balance risk. The second place where we have agreements with policing agencies has to do with staff safety. So George referenced the calling maybe the child abuse hotline or intake our intake sites. It's important to understand that we have 24/7 coverage in Alberta, and so we do have not only the dedicated teams in Edmonton and Calgary where the police and our staff are paired up to answer calls, but we also have after-hours workers in every neck of the woods in Alberta. And so when calls come in after hours that need to be responded to, depending on the nature of the call, we may do two things. We may ask for police assistance, or we may just call to say, is this a family that we're familiar with? Is there anything to be worried about? Which helps make the determination in an after-hours basis. Do you need to send two staff? Is there risk associated with this call or not? So overall, in the child intervention context, when people ask what needs to be different so people can share information, the legislation is pretty explicit and pretty clear already as it relates to information sharing, and it's enabling legislation, not disabling legislation. And I think George referenced that it's a bit of a culture shift. People take the privacy of the people that they work with very seriously, And so sometimes need to be encouraged to step back and look at the broader context under which these kids and families live with multiple partners. And so it's not, as George pointed out, simply a matter of your accountability to share the right information. It's also the accountability for the information that doesn't get shared that could have helped a child or a family. I am going to turn it back to George for some final comments.
So, so I mentioned earlier about needing to leverage some of the existing patterns, or the patterns that we see. And part of that work is really trying to take a look at how do we then reduce some of the duplication, maybe get rid of some of the impediments that get in the way. And as we go through things, start to identify other areas that need conversations, dialogue to take place. As we've been doing sessions, for example, and talking through and working through some of the concerns that arise, it's been identified that, and I heard mentioned that many of you are social workers. The professionals work for organizations, and they are often also part of another organization, being colleges, professional colleges. So under the Health Professions Act, I think there's some 28 different colleges, including the College of Social Workers and the College of Alberta Psychologists. Those colleges have standards of practice and codes of conduct, and those are important things to have in place. Sometimes people interpret that in a very narrow way, as well as the interpretation of legislation in a very narrow way. And so we are having dialogue primarily through Alberta Health, because they are responsible for the Health Professions Act, about how do we ensure that professionals, members of these colleges, also have an understanding and that the college supports them in being able to do the things that they need to do, again, to support those best outcomes. We have a public-facing website. We've developed a number of resources, including training about what it is that you can and cannot do and how it is that you should actually be working. And as Joni mentioned, this is not about opening everybody's files to everybody and just have at her. It's taking a judicious look at what is necessary to be shared in order to support individuals as the organizations are collaborating and working together. Because this is not just for government departments, the public-facing site does have the e-learning or the modules, the training, available to the public so that it can reach out to the school authorities and so to the agencies that are engaged as well. And that means that Joe Public can take that training if they were so inclined. There's a number of resources as well that are posted up there, and so we're trying to ensure that there's a dissemination of that information and that we try to reach as broad an area as possible. Not only talking about the things that they can do, but the things that they have to be responsible for, and how do we support these organizations to better manage information so that they can be part of the construct as well. A lot of the work that we do is really taking a look at not just the authority, because the authority already exists in legislation quite often, and it's fairly clear in many respects as long as you apply that broad lens. But it's the other things that come along with that. So what are the roles and responsibilities? If we're going to work together, what does that actually look like? Who is going to do what? How do we ensure that we're managing the information in a way that does meet the requirements of the legislation, both program and privacy legislation? And by developing framework approaches to that, then that helps to start to put that in place. And there's some examples that you have on the slide there about some of those integrated services. Joni mentioned a couple of the ones with the police services. We are looking at other ones. For example, not only do we have CART right now, which is the child abuse response team that involves police officers and social workers together. There's starting to be work around the domestic conflict response teams and the need for officers and social workers to work together in terms of the domestic violence. There's areas that we're looking at working with Alberta Health Services, for example, cumulative risk clinics that are run by pediatricians that need to identify and assess and then determine treatment plans. Can't do that in isolation of some of the information that we have. So all of those things are things that we look at when we're looking at how do we improve some of the services, and it's all enabled by the legislation as it currently exists. Thank you.
All right, that brings us to the point of questions, and we are, as we're running a bit late, we're going to eat a bit into our supper hours, so in order to give everybody a chance, go to about 5:15. First on my list, I've got, Rick, did you want to?
Sure. Thanks, Chair. I guess the big question for me that I was waiting for is where can we improve the privacy legislation? And you referenced it, and then you didn't answer the question. How, is there any place the legislation can be better? Because it's kind of like the only reason we're here is to find out how we can make things better, but every time we get to the point of asking for that information, we don't get it. So is there something you can?
So I think my point was really that the legislation, when you read it and interpret it, I guess at a management level, looks pretty enabling already. So is it legislation that needs to be changed? Or is it continued work on the culture of understanding how to manage people's information that doesn't require legislative amendments? That's really was the point that I was trying to make. Section 126 in Child, Youth, and Family Enhancement Act is extremely enabling. I have not in my almost 25 years of delivering services found a situation where I couldn't find a way to share information if required.
Okay, well, I'll just say, Chair, my frustration here is that I feel like we're running in circles here a little bit because it always seems like the system, when we ask for improvements to the system, nobody has one. And we ask which exact person is responsible, there doesn't ever seem to be one. So as long as no one's responsible and the system's never broken, I guess everything ought to be perfect. But we're here talking because everything isn't perfect, and yet nobody wants, I'm sure there's people that have been talking to us that know how to improve the system, and yet for some reason, they're not telling us. So, and I think the speakers did a wonderful presentation. I'm not criticizing them. I'm just speaking a little more broadly in that we keep asking for how the system could be improved and keep getting zeros for answers, so.
If I could, one of the things that, that I discussed was that the current privacy landscape, the environment is fairly complex for many organizations to understand. And part of that is because the legislation is different. It's not harmonized. So is there is there room for improvement? Absolutely. But
Can you tell us what
that
sections,
said-
can you tell us what sections you'd like to change and how you'd like to change them?
I think that there are probably a number of things that we'll need to look at in terms of suggestions for changes. There are some things that I spoke to that are different. In the FOIP Act, again, we have the ability to share information for integrated or common programs and services. We do not have that in the Health Information Act, and yet we know that the health of individuals is supported by all of the programs and processes in the community, or need to be. And so there are places that become a little bit more evident as you start to dig into things of that nature. We do not have the not-for-profit sector subject to any privacy legislation. There's reasons for that, and so those reasons have to be weighed by yourselves and by others at a much different pay scale than mine.
Well, even that, knowing what sections have to be waived at appropriate times would be helpful. So, thank you for that. Yeah, last, if you'll allow it, Chair, and I'm trying not to take any extra time up. You talked about how private, the information on a personal file that's being shared, you tell the person whose file it is, or whose information it is, that it's being shared. I think that's terrific. Does that, my question is, does that include people whose child has been seized? Because as you might imagine, in our elected offices, happy people don't call, mostly unhappy people call. And unhappy people, as you can imagine, would include parents whose child has been seized. And once their child's been seized, they feel like everybody else has got all the information in the world and they don't have any. Is that true?
I hope it's not true. The intent is that, so if your question is, do families continue to receive information about their children?
Do the parents whose child has been seized, do they get information on do they get to find out who their information has been shared to and why?
Ideally, they're always aware of who has their information, despite the fact that we can share, as we discussed. Principally, they should be aware that we're sharing with doctors, we're sharing with schools. Does it happen on a daily basis to say we've talked to the school because there's an event going on? There's a range there for sure. But should the parents also, was part of your question, I'm just trying to understand the question, whether or not we continue to share information with the parents?
Yes.
Yes, so absolutely, particularly considering that they, until such time as their children are the subject of a permanent guardianship order, they remain a legal guardian to that child. So they have the right to all of the information that we're collecting.
Thank you. I could go on, but I think I need to yield the floor to the other committee members here. Thanks.
If I could add a quick comment to that. One of the things that we observe is, and we do try to ensure that people understand how their information is flowing, how it's going to be connected to things. People are in crisis quite often when they're involved with us and they don't hear everything that is told. And sometimes we have to repeat that, and at various times we have to go through that again with them.
Thank you.
Next, I'll go to Nicole, followed by Jason, and just a reminder to please turn your microphones off when you're not using them. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I'm curious if all review bodies involved in the child death review process have access to the same information about a child's death. An example being, would a fatality inquiry and the OCYA review have access to the same case information? And if not, why?
Yes, they do have access to the same information. So they have access to information that's prepared out of the Office of the Statutory Director, so the initial examination typically. But they also both have access to redacted actual copies of the child's file. Again, redacted for third-party information, for privileged information. So they are both bodies that have very liberal access to that information.
Some of the other review bodies may not need that same degree of information. Occupational health and safety, as an example, is not looking so much at the child's circumstances as the environment in which an accident may have occurred if it's at a work site.
Jason, followed by Peter.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Just building a little bit on my colleague, Mr. McIver's comments. There's a lot of information. We've been tasked specifically with a very specific task, particularly at the first phase of this panel, which is in regards to the child death review process. So it seemed to me in your answers to Mr. McIver that you were indicating that that there's not a necessary need for legislative changes in your recommendations, but that there would be it sounds like maybe the way it's interpreted by the department. Am I understanding that correctly?
George referenced in one of his slides that there is and it's not inconsistent with Rod Knecht's commentary that there's very literal interpretation. There's very literal interpretation of legislation, and then there's a principled interpretation of legislation. And so, where people are very cautious about sharing information, the legislation can support that because you can find an opt-out. Having said that, the legislation is enabling legislation, and so my commentary was that the information sharing strategy that George was referencing is all about trying to harmonize some of the understanding and interpretation of everybody's legislation and create a culture where we share information because it's better for clients, and be less sort of risk averse to that sharing. We carry very personal information about people, and so the fact that staff are cautious about it, as an Albertan, I sort of appreciate that. But so long as information is required by other bodies in order to protect kids and help families, we need to be finding that balance.
So that leads to the question. Let's just assume it's not a legislative change needed for the purpose of this question. I'm not sure if everybody would agree on that, but certainly that's your position. What areas of the legislation would have to be interpreted differently to deal with some of the concerns that are around the death review process specifically?
If I think about the presentations from the other death review systems, I don't recall any of them identifying issues with information sharing between those bodies specific to the information they needed to access from the child intervention system.
So then just one follow-up, Madam Chair, and I'll yield the floor. Is it primarily frontline workers that were determining that or interpreting that legislation during the process, or is that automatically, punted up higher for that decision to be made?
You're speaking specific to like review processes?
That's what we're here for, yep.
So the request for file information specific to review processes does happen at different levels of the organization than a frontline worker. Frontline workers don't make the determination to provide a redacted file, for example, to the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate. That happens in more of a centralized process because that information in the state that it ends up being is useful for several review bodies. And so that just makes a whole bunch of sense from a capacity perspective, from a legal perspective, to have that flow through a centralized function. And signed off. The other piece I'll speak to is sometimes the historical investigations, for example, you're really casting a fairly wide net on a bunch of people's personal information. And so then you want to have different eyes on it to sign off the release, to make sure that we are maintaining that balance of supporting a criminal investigation and doing the best we can to protect the information of people who might be impacted.
In your view, there's no common thread that you're aware of different stakeholders and all. There's a lot of different people involved. I understand that. But there's no common thread of concern in regards specifically to this legislation.
What I will say is, given the fact that there's multiple pieces of legislation, and if you're working under the Health Information Act, for example, and you're dealing with agencies that might be for-profit agencies who are under another PIPA legislation, that could be complicated. Harmonizing legislation would certainly be helpful, but it's also on the ground, how do people interpret those pieces? So it's a combination. I guess my opinion would be that legislation in and of itself provides a bit of a guideline, but it's how people interpret it on the ground and the culture they develop around it. But certainly harmonized, for sure, would be helpful.
Peter, followed by Graham.
So I want to ask, I think, what's a complicated question. A driving force behind, I think, this panel and the former Minister Bular's panel was a sense that the child protection system was not transparent in the review process, and so that there was significant guarding of information. Some of which was changed a little bit as a result of some of the media coverage. And so I guess one of the questions I have is really more about the transparency of the review process as opposed to what goes into the review process. The Fatality Review Board and the Domestic Violence Board, it's not the correct name, but the Domestic Violence Board, were both fairly clear that the privacy of information was paramount to transparency. The Child and Youth Advocate led towards more transparency in the aim of being able to frame the systemic problems. The Chief Medical Examiner argued for the summative approach, which would be exampled in the pediatric death review committees, as opposed to a more open case-per-case approach. All of that begs, though, I think, the degree to which legislation or policy enables the transparency that seems to have driven the conversations on this, driven the creation of this panel, as well as to the previous panel that Minister Bular put forward. So in this complicated question, I guess what I'm really trying to drive at is where's the pathway to transparency? And we see some agencies like the Fatality Review and Domestic Violence saying the pathway is very narrow. So where do we see that pathway to transparency in terms of the death review process, and what should be shared with the public, and what legislation is required to enable that sharing? Sorry about the complication of the question, but.
Great question. Early on, I talked about that continuum of information and that spectrum at the one end where we're needing to deal with very identifying information, both personal and health information about individuals, in order to provide them with services. That's the world that most of our staff live in. They have to work with that information. They have to work with the individuals. They are working with crisis. They are working with very traumatic events. They have to be able to work through all of that and provide the best services that they can and share the information necessary to do that. In the middle, towards the end, then we're talking about, so how do we ensure that the public is aware about the things that are going on, and especially from a systemic perspective. And that's where we need to be able to take a look at some of the trends and what are the things that identify those trends without trampling on the very personal stories at times. And that's not to say that there are not individuals who want their stories to be told, but that's, at the same time, there's a lot of very sensitive information that is gathered throughout that whole process. How it becomes a bit of a balance in taking a look at how do we ensure that we're able to put information out into the public realm that shows, that speaks to things like systemic recommendations. How are we addressing those? How are they being identified? How are they being addressed? When you're looking at the various review panels that are before you, that have been identified to you, they have different mandates and they have different areas that they have to focus on. So how do you start to connect those pieces in different ways? When you're looking at the reports coming from the Chief Medical Examiner's Office, that information has to support some of the findings and further investigation by others. And so there's more probably gathered from that to children's than the other way around. But on the other hand, the Child and Youth Advocate does have a responsibility to take a look at, are there issues from a systemic perspective, but also being able to drill into seeing what's going on in order to be able to bring that forward from a systemic perspective. And so they end up being a balance as well.
So we end up with the kind of conversation, though, that I think from a transparency point of view sabotages what you've just described. That is, we end up with the case that brought this panel together. We end up with the Redita case that we saw the decision on a few weeks ago. And so we end up with that environment where we get these flares that come out into the public, but we don't have a transparent method of being able to respond to the flares or be able to assure the public of the ongoing security of the system. How do we do that?
So the increased coordination between review bodies would certainly assist that, because it would tie together who's reviewing that circumstance by when, which sort of helps everybody understand what the trajectory is. And we do have different review bodies that have different thresholds for how they see information. As you indicated, Dr. Cho, the OCYA is pretty clear that they do not want to have a family identified through their investigation process, which is why they choose carefully how to frame some of their information, but the same child's death that's reviewed through a Fatality Inquiry Board no longer has that protection. So Fatality Inquiry Act, since the removal of the publication ban on the names of deceased children, allow for that to be published in the newspaper, so their names are disclosed in court.
Still doesn't quite answer where I'm getting to,
yeah, I'm
which
getting
is
there.
how do we have a transparent mechanism when things go wrong in which we assure the public that the system is working?
If I say it's a great question, so if you're talking from the perspective of practitioners in the field, I think that to the extent that we can push out enough detail that gives a sense of the circumstance without actually identifying the child or their family, finding that balance would be ideal. Because in an ideal state, as you referenced, there is some assurance, but does that assurance to the public come at the cost of an individual's privacy? And that is, we work with families who have lots of things that have gone on for them, but even in families where lots of things haven't gone on for them, if you can imagine what your life would look like on paper, and having that information debated in a public forum, we have to find the balance between providing those assurances, which we're accountable for, but not pointing to particular families and having public debate around their personal information. It is a balancing act for sure, and I think that the ministry has been working on how do you push out more and more information in a way that doesn't allow somebody to Google search and find that person's name. That's becoming trickier and trickier with the environment that we're under right now, but certainly that's the aspiration.
I've got Graham, Maria, and Bruce still on my list, and I don't want to take much more than about 5 more minutes. So if we can keep things moving along, I appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Chair. I'll try to keep my preamble brief then. Some of what you commented on that you alluded to is that the FOIP Act has about 30 plus clauses that provide you with the tools that you need to be able to share and disclose. But the challenge is that you don't necessarily enact those tools on a timely basis. And then I heard the term culture of understanding of a lot of what the legislation is a challenge within many departments. So with that being said, what principles in the legislation do you think we need to enshrine differently than we are doing today?
The privacy legislation, especially the FOIP Act, is about balance. When it first was introduced, though, people did a bit of a collective gasp and said, I can't talk to you anymore, because they looked at the one end of the fulcrum, that being privacy, and privacy overshadowing everything else, and we can't talk to you anymore, we can't share information. And there's concerns that have continued to emerge because of fear maybe of the Commissioner's office. I mean, we've seen people now being charged and receiving fines. Those came under the Health Information Act, and they're for people being stupid, being egregious in the things that they're doing. All of the privacy legislation contains clauses that allow you to recognize that people will make mistakes, but if they're good faith mistakes, they're not going to be punished for that. So part of what the strategy and the work that has been done is really reinforcing that you are supported as a staff person to make the right decisions, that the policies and the practices that are in place are being reviewed and ensuring that they address that as well. So if there's a message that should go out, is that the legislation as it exists right now, while not perfect, is pretty enabling, and does allow for organizations and individuals working for those organizations to work together, that ultimately really what you have to be looking at is what is the best interest of the clients that you're serving, and the rest becomes a tool set to help that.
So if I can sort of throw an example to this, because, for example, let's say Rick's here is in distress, and I have to perform CPR on him. I know that if I break his ribs doing that I'm not going to get sued, and it's been enshrined to me that I know that. No way I would take care of you. But with that being said, how do you create that culture within that ministry? Because I've heard concerns that's a fear that exists right now.
It is a fear. It's why we've developed some of the resources we've developed. It's why the training has been developed, and the training speaks to those things. It's also ensuring that the staff are supported from the top down, and so we're not just focusing on the delivery of services, but we're focusing as well on everyone from the executive team to the staff, so that there's a common understanding of that. And there is buy-in. But it is going to take time. I described the numbers that we're dealing with. And there's a lot of different organizations.
Maria, followed by Bruce.
Thank you, and I do have a little preamble. My personal objective with this panel is to find out what went wrong. And I want to do that so it never happens again. My objective is not to place blame on somebody, because having worked in corrections, I've seen lots of inquiries where people wanted to blame somebody and it wasn't somebody, it was little bits and pieces of the process. So I just wanted to start from there. So my question is, what constraints have child intervention identified when it comes to the legislation that governs our external partners?
So can I ask a question of clarification? Your question is about other partners and access to their information?
I guess what I'm trying to say is, how can we work with our partners under federal or other legislation to improve the outcomes and strengthen the death review process? Does that clarify for you?
I think I'll go to the tightest legislation and point to the Health Information Act. And George referenced that there is an ongoing conversation happening about loosening up the ability for people to share information across programs. I think that's one area, sort of depending on where you're situated in the health system, where people tend to be still fairly guarded. And I mean, I have personal health information too, so I appreciate that. But that, I think, is one area that sometimes we find slightly constraining, and particularly if they're medical practitioners that haven't ever interacted with child intervention before. So that's more a matter of the ongoing socialization, but maybe removing some of the perceived barriers there. George is more familiar with all of those clauses of the legislation than I am, so.
I think Joni's right. The Health Information Act, as I mentioned, does not have a provision that allows for work from a common or integrated program or service perspective. That's not to say you can't enter into agreements, but it starts to add more administrivia when you do have to do those things. And so that probably is one of the areas that is seen as a constraint, is that harder ability to share information outside of the medical arena. The other area that does come to mind, though, is that we do work with a lot of organizations, and we don't always contract with them. So if they are not subject to any privacy legislation, then the comfort level in working with an organization and sharing any information with them, it, first of all, has to become very much a consent-based process, but the comfort level and their accountability for that information is different because they are not subject to any privacy legislation. They are not subject to any oversight by anyone. And it's not to say that they're doing the wrong things, and many of them are great organizations, but the accountability mechanisms are not in place.
Thank you both.
Last question, Bruce.
Thank you for your presentation. I want to just follow up on slide number 3, where you talked about some of the competing tensions as it relates to information sharing. And you've highlighted four areas that in some ways can compete, other ways could collaborate perhaps, but they all have an impact upon effective information sharing with the balancing act about improving client and family outcomes. So my question would be, how would we know if we've achieved a good balance? How would we know if we've reached that optimum point of information sharing that doesn't exceed one of your tensions, but really doesn't complicate it either? What are some of the indicators that would help us understand if we got there or not? Is that clear?
It's a fair question, absolutely. And certainly as we're pushing out this work, as we're looking at how do we increase the ability to do better by our clients, it becomes very difficult to measure success in terms of are we sharing more information or not. It's more that we have to take a look at what are the outcomes, and are the outcomes the ones that we want to achieve? Are we seeing that while we do that, there's still that individual's right to privacy? Doing this right means that people still have a right to privacy, and that privacy is managed by all of the organizations that are involved, that they all understand and manage information properly. It's not that it's now going to become information that's available on the street corner. It has to be managed in a very clear expectations about how that's going to be done in confidence, and so that need to have harmonized legislation to a degree does support some of that, because then everybody understands what that playing field looks like. However, we need to ensure that people continue to access the services that they require. We're not seeing dips in services because of something that we're doing, and people are not moving away from something because of fear. How we measure that becomes, it'll be interesting, but we are looking at how we evaluate some of these integrated service approaches. Are they getting us to the outcomes that we want Albertans to be able to benefit from? Are we setting them up for success, or are we getting in the way? Those are the sorts of things that we're having to evaluate as we go through all of this. Not a great answer, I know. It's not a black and white type of science behind this.
If I could just add to that, if families are saying that they don't need to tell their story over and over again to get help, that's a good sign. That's a sign that we're placing. I think the other piece is in hindsight reviews, we hope to see over time that one of the issues isn't that one agency had information that could have been used by another agency, and that didn't happen. So that's a common recommendation that comes out of review processes. So we would hope to see that those kinds of findings aren't happening.
Thank you.
All right, we are at 5:25. I'm going to suggest we take a half-hour supper break and then reconvene at 5 minutes to 6. The Grassland Room will be closed during this time. Panel members are invited to the Aspen Room for dinner. The public is welcome to stay in the building and return after dinner. We will reconvene at 5 minutes to 6 in the Capitol View Room, which is more conducive to the facilitated discussion and conversation that we'll have after that, and the audio stream will move over as well. The big open one.
So our role here tonight is to help facilitate conversations amongst the panel, and we really see our role as providing a neutral presence, guiding process, and enabling you to focus solely on the content. So that's basically what brings us here today. Much like last meeting, I would just start with just a reiteration of making sure we're all here for the same purposes. So again, we're focused on facilitation, but as I have here for the purposes of the panel, in the terms of references, is to identify recommendations to streamline, strengthen the child death review process, identify which agency have primary authority for conducting these reviews, examining internal communication protocol to ensure timely access to information for relevant agencies, develop possible criteria for which deaths would be reviewed, and making recommendations for legislative changes. Is that shared amongst us all? Okay, perfect. So we have a tight agenda here this evening. We have roughly an hour and 50 minutes to get through everything. Overall, what we'll focus at the start of today on is validating the information and the notes from our previous meeting. Once we go through that, we'll look at kind of the overall process that we need to go through in order to get to recommendations. And then tonight, we'll really focus the bulk majority of our time on refining the issues that we started to identify at the last meeting. Does that sound good to everybody? Alrighty. So I'm going to get us started right away. You should have all received a document outlining the notes from last meeting. Did everybody have a chance to look at that? Do you have that with you currently? Okay. I just wanted to maybe give you 2 minutes just to leaf through that individually, and then we're just going to ask some questions, make sure that it's reflective of your conversation before we move forward. So I'll just give you 2 minutes to roughly leaf through that, and then we'll start with some conversation questions. Alrighty. So I'm going to come back and interject, and we'll start a conversation. The biggest thing we want to know about this document is do we find it reflective of the conversation that we had in the last meeting? So we'll give everyone a chance to respond to that just to get us started. Perhaps we'll start to my left at this table. And Heather, I know you haven't had a chance to review it, so we'll skip over you and we'll go to Nicole. But we'll just offer quickly if we feel more or less this reflects the conversation or if there's concerns that we have.
I had an opportunity to review it, I believe, this morning, and it seemed very reflective of the conversation, and nothing stands out to me that's missing.
All right, perfect. Thank you.
I feel the same way.
Okay.
I agree.
Ditto.
Didn't bring my thesaurus, so I'll say I agree as well too.
We have a mic at this table, just so you can hold on to that one. Greg, do you want to get us started?
This document certainly does reflect what we discussed. I guess I would ask if there is an opportunity to add anything to it that we perhaps didn't discuss last week, and if this is the right time to do that, if that's allowed, or if there's another point.
So when you say add anything to it that we didn't discuss?
Well, specifically, the one thing I was reminded of is under the comprehensiveness and inclusion of all stakeholders, just to be specific and explicit that we do want to hear the voices of people formerly in care. Mm-hmm. And that was something that was discussed at the very first meeting, but it's not really something that we've brought up since. Okay. I feel it fits under here, but I thought perhaps we have an opportunity to be a bit more explicit about that specific point.
Yeah, so we'll get Lisa to capture the notes. Any concerns that we do have, we'll bring to the Secretariat. Was there anything you wanted to elaborate on that point?
No, just that was the only one for me. Thanks.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's fine.
Yeah, me too.
Just building on Greg's point, I agree. I think it was more than just children, though. I think it was a couple of varieties of people with lived experience.
I wasn't at the last meeting. I did talk with my colleague that sat in for me. And the one thing that I like on accountability, clarity on who is responsible for the implementation of the recommendations. But what's missing for me, and I apologize I couldn't make the meeting, is that there's what's missing is who's responsible for each child when something bad happens or they're dead or injured or something. These are important issues. So it's that accountability piece I think that's missing. But outside of that, my colleague said this represents things fairly, and I'm in concurrence with what's there.
Thank you.
I wasn't there.
All right, thank you. So most people said that you felt it was reflective. There's a couple pieces that we wanted to add in there. Was there any other concerns that people wanted to address before we move forward? Heather?
Sorry, I had to go for a minute to sit in the chair, but I just wanted to clarify around when we're looking at recommendations that we're being clear that the recommendations that we're talking about are from the review panels and not from us, in the sense of like when we want to make sure we have tangible accountability and reporting and things like that, that we're discussing the 7 different panels that could potentially make recommendations. We're not talking about our recommendation. Does that make sense?
If you can just provide more clarification around that.
So I think a lot of the recommendations that we've been talking about that we discussed last week, when we were referring to recommendations, we were actually talking about, is there duplication? Are the recommendations looking at the different, like when we have a family violence panel versus another panel, when they're looking at those recommendations, are they clear? Are they not duplicating each other? Are they not contradicting each other? Like, we want to make sure that all of the, they're basically clear and that they're accountable and that we can measure them. I think when we read this, it looks like we're talking about our recommendations. We're not actually talking about the recommendations from the death review process. And so I just want to make sure that we're clarifying that it is the recommendations that are provided through the death review process, not the recommendations that we as a panel will potentially make.
Other people care to comment on that?
So can I just ask for clarification?
Yeah.
So just for clarification, I captured that, be clear that the recommendations are inclusive of the 7 processes panels, not just this panel. Is that capture, or the opposite? Sorry.
Sorry, no, it's my bad. No, I don't think that this panel should be included, because I think what we're looking at and what we've been discussing over the last few meetings has been understanding the recommendations that are coming from the death review process and how those work with each other and all of those questions, not about our recommendations.
Okay, perfect. Any other concerns that we want to address and bring to the Secretariat in terms of the document or the conversation from last week? Okay. In order to bring us back into some of that issue space, certainly we had brought up kind of 6 key issues that we are starting to see formulate, and we're going to want to work on those here further today. Just thinking about that conversation, I'd like to maybe get some reflections on things that stood out to you from last week. So thinking about the conversation we had, the issues that we identified, what are some of the things that stood out to you, and what are you taking, or what did you take away from last week that you're bringing with you this week? So we'll just go popcorn style if anyone would like to start and share. Cameron?
One of the things that stood out for me is having more Indigenous and multicultural representation in the review process.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. What else stood out for people? Patty?
Timeliness. That there has to be some timeliness to these. The reports have to be done, and we threw around the idea of a year. And I think that we, at all costs, have to get to a point where the review process matches up with family grieving process.
Jason?
Accountability, not only for during the process, but for the results of the recommendations after the process.
I think one thing that really stood out to me is consultation with a lot of the frontline to understand if the recommendations we are providing for them are actually tangible and obtainable.
Maria?
For me, it was certainly the inclusion of other voices, to have a different perspective on what needs to be there.
Heather?
Just going back to timeliness, I think a point that I need to understand that I'm still a little confused about is the process around criminal investigations versus the review panel investigation or reviews, and sort of what the implications are if there is a criminal investigation and how that impacts our timelines, or does it impact our timelines?
Greg?
I'll just repeat the earlier point that I think Indigenous voices, I think, is very important, as is the timeliness. And I do think that under effectiveness, measurable outcomes, if I were to add something new, is very important, which feeds back into the accountability question. We need to know whether success is happening, and it's very difficult to do that if we can't measure.
Yeah, absolutely. Nicole?
Families and communities. We need to make sure that families and communities are better supported throughout the death review process, and that we're able to provide an opportunity for them to share their stories.
Any last thoughts? Things that we took away from last week, we're bringing with us this week?
I think it'd be about clarifying the points of overlap and looking at ensuring that it doesn't need to happen twice. That if an interview happens, that's data that can be used in multiple investigations, multiple locations, finding ways of streamlining the whole process in a timely way, as you mentioned.
Perfect.
I'm good.
You're good?
Yeah.
All right. Awesome. Thanks for going through that, validating the material that we've gone through, providing some of the concerns, and also providing reflections on last week. It is important to get back into that headspace around the key issues that we're seeing, because today we're going to be spending a great deal of our time refining what we saw in those issues. So last week we identified where we have common interests and where we're seeing common issues. We also got to look at the characteristics. Now tonight what we're really going to focus on is developing what the problem statement is around those issues. So it's really, we see an issue, okay, so what is the problem that we need to really address within that issue, and why do we see that as an issue? And that crafts basically what becomes a problem statement. So it's all part of that overall process that we talked about last week of making sure that we're going divergent in terms of our thinking and the information we're gathering, and then converging on terms of where do we see the issues. So tonight's an important aspect of that. Of course, the overall process, once we leave here tonight, will be to start thinking about, okay, what other issues are we seeing? What are we hearing from groups as we interview with them? But also to start thinking about what types of recommendations are we seeing that would make sense, and start generating potential options for us to discuss at our meeting on the 30th around recommendations. So with that, once we leave here tonight, one of the things that we're going to ask you to do is to do a little bit of homework in preparation for our meeting on the 30th to see what type of options and recommendations you're starting to formulate. It'll go a long way if we are going to land on recommendations by the April 6th, if we can start doing some of that work in between meetings at this point in time. But in order to even get there tonight, we really got to refine what those issue statements are. Does that make sense? Any questions there? Alrighty, so one of the things I'm going to hand out to you, because I recognize that language can be tricky, is the flip chart notes from our last session. So these are basically the verbatim notes that we wrote up here. And I do this just so that we can get the same language that we discussed in our key issues. So when you open up this document on the third page, there'll be the top row of a table will have everything in bolded letters. And those bolded words are basically the issue statements that we created in space here together. And they read as follows. It says accountability, transparency, line of sight around recommendations, collaboration with implementers as a area of focus and an issue we wanted to look at. Too many review processes doing the same thing, and communication issues going back to the duplication. Ensuring all stakeholders are supported through processes and advocated for their voice to be heard. Privacy used for legitimate reasons, not to avoid accountability. Indigenous voice, experience, leadership needed throughout the process. Also need to be inclusive of all systems. Voices requires cultural expertise. And last but not least, a cross-ministry collaboration and leadership in the death review process and implementation of recommendation ownership. And then there was a little bit of a process that we saw in terms of the first 6 months, second 6 months. So those were the issues that were identified. If you flip it through to the next side, you'll see at the very bottom of the page we have an area called issue characteristics, and that's where we went around, we started discussing what we see as characteristics of issues. So we're going further down that refinement path. Today, what I want you to do is to take that issue statement, to take the characteristics, and really define what the problem statements are. So what is the problem that that we're seeing within these issues, and why do we see it as an issue? So the way I see this working to start, if we can divide and conquer, separate out the issues 3 and 3 per table, get you to go through a worksheet that we have created around what we're seeing and the problems in those issues, and then why do we see those as issues, have you define some of the problem statements and reflect, and then present them back to the group. And then as a whole, we can say, you know what, is this the problem statement that we're really we're identifying together, or is there something here that needs to be added or changed? But that's basically the process that we have outlined for you today, is to really refine by looking at what the problem statement is under each issue. Does that make sense? Okay. So Lisa, I'll get you to hand these ones out. Sure. So as Lisa hands out, there's basically a worksheet that will ask you to populate. On that worksheet, the first column is to basically identify the issue you're working on. The second column is why is this a problem? Or sorry, what is the problem under this issue? The third column is why is this a problem? And then the fourth column asks you to basically generate a statement, the problem statement. So what is the problem and why does it exist? And at the bottom of it, you'll see there's an example. So an example of a good problem statement is our database system is out of date and incompatible with new operating systems from leading IT providers, which limits our ability to utilize data effectively. So you identify what the problem is and then identify why it's a problem. Lisa?
Yeah, so for clarification, there isn't a worksheet for every individual. It's that you'll be working on 3 issues per table. And so that's why there's, I believe, at least 3 or 4 problem worksheets there. And so that is just a place for you guys to record your thoughts collectively on that worksheet. And then we'll exchange the ideas that you generate and the ideas that you generate and have an opportunity to add and augment and build. So we result with a complete and holistic picture of your perspective on the issue and the problem statement. And then the purpose then would be to use that to help us inform our your recommendations, not ours. So,
thank you.
All right.
So any questions after that, after Lisa's brief interjection? All right, so I'm going to assign out the issues that per table, which I'd like you to start your conversations around. So for this table, we'll start with accountability, transparency, line of sight around recommendations, and collaboration with implementers. We'll look at too many review processes doing the same thing, communication issues, duplication, and ensure all stakeholders are supported throughout the process and advocated for their voice to be heard. Yeah, so the first 3.
Okay, thank you very much.
No problem. Over here, we'll look at privacy used for legitimate reasons, not to avoid accountability. Indigenous voice experience leadership needed through its process need to be inclusive of all systems voices, and across ministry collaboration leadership within the death review process and implementation of recommendations ownership. Does that make sense? Okay. Yep. So I'll give you roughly 20 minutes to start that conversation, and then we'll read the room as we're going through. So at this point, I'm going to bring us back together. What we'll do is we'll present basically what the key issue we were working on is, what the problem statement that we developed is, and then give us a flavor for the considerations that went into developing that problem statement. So we'll just go group by group. Once the information is presented, that's when we'll go back and we'll ask if there are any questions or clarifications, if there's agreement in terms of what we're seeing as the problem statement under that issue. Sound good? Okay, so I'll start over here. Graham, why don't you take us through the first one that you worked on?
Okay, so.
Oh, you need the mic.
Thank you. No, I'll hold it because then I can do a mic drop after. So privacy used for legitimate reasons was the key issue. And tell me to slow down if I'm speaking too fast. So the description of the problem was some sectors withholding information essential to better care, lack of understanding of legislation, fear of reprisal, lack of communication with service providers to the detriment of who they are serving. Why is it a problem? Sorry, my...
Spend too much time together. Okay, so we're problem statements? Yeah, okay. Public service. Oh, public perceives government is hiding info to avoid accountability. However, what is the balance between protecting families and the right to know? And then we had a second one.
Mm-hmm.
Supporting the family to understand the implications of the publication ban.
Can you say that last piece again?
Supporting the family to understand the implications of the publication ban.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So I would ask from this table, are there any objections in terms of, or actually first, questions of clarification on anything you just heard? Peter?
I'm not sure I understand the concern about the publication ban. Can you just expand that a bit?
So this goes back to the conversation around the 4 days and supporting families in understanding that if they would like to have a publication ban, they have to do it within the first 4 days.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Are there questions of clarification from this table? Are there any objections to anything you heard? No? Okay, thank you very much. We'll move to this table. Again, give us the issue that you were working on, the problem statement you came up with, and some of the details that went into your conversation.
So we had started looking at too many review processes doing the same thing, and to be honest, we wound up doing accountability at the same time. So the statement that we came up with of the problem is that there are unmandated groups doing overlapping work in silos without an accountability framework. Further, the stat director has too much power to determine whether an external investigation happens. And why this is a problem is because it reduces public confidence, it creates less clear recommendations, and it leads to an undetermined accountability to those recommendations.
Thank you. From this table, any questions of clarification that you have from what you just heard? Any objections to anything you heard from that group around that issue? All righty. So we'll go back to this table. What was the next one that you worked on?
The next one we did was Indigenous voice, experience, leadership needed throughout process, need to be inclusive of all systems voices, requires cultural expertise. And so we described the problem as decisions, recommendations being made without cultural lens or Indigenous voice, representation, the panels need to represent people within the system, failure to acknowledge historical trauma and lack of info and education, why it's a problem, inferior care, recommendations aren't one size fits all, needs specific to cultural experiences. And then the problem statement is recommendations seem to be representative of all Albertans, which minimizes or ignores cultural experiences of families, imposing solutions that recipients are unable to implement.
Okay, thank you. So back to this table, any questions of clarification that you have for this group? Any objections to their problem statement?
Could be expansion.
Tell me more about that, Peter.
As I was listening to you, I'm not going to put this very well because it's kind of an unformed thought that was coming out as I was listening to you, but it's as though we continue to see a review process from a dominant society view that we're attempting to adapt to the Indigenous community, as opposed to saying, how can we work with the Indigenous community to have a review process that works from an Indigenous perspective?
Yeah, and I think that is what we were trying to say. The other part that we also talked about, though, was not just the Indigenous voice, but also our new Canadians that have experienced trauma, whether living in refugee camps or things like that, that they are also bringing with them that may be being impacted by the system. And so recognizing that, yes, we need to have an Indigenous lens, but we also need to make sure that we're having a new Canadian lens, so it has to be specific to the cultural experience. So you could have a main recommendation, but you need to have sub-recommendations that go back to that impact an Indigenous lens as well as a new Canadian lens. Like, it can't just be the perspective of it has to serve all Albertans, because Alberta is a multicultural Indigenous community that is not European descendants, primarily.
Does that hold it for you, Peter? I see a thumbs up. Is that hope that's a good thing, right?
Yes, I went there.
All right, perfect. All right, so you. Thanks for the clarification. So you guys only got through the first one, so I'll come back to Heather if you can go through your third one, and then we'll go through that and before we go to the next piece.
We did 2 in 1. We're that good.
We're efficient.
I have captured that the fact that your report back
Was inclusive of 2.
was inclusive of
Yeah, that
your
was
2.
my
Okay.
mistake. So back to this table.
Okay, so the last one that we did was across ministry collaboration and reduction timelines. So we said duplication and poor communication in panels that can impede timely collaboration, which renews trauma in families. Why this is a problem? This prolongs the grieving process. If reviews take a long time, recommendations may no longer apply. Public confidence is impacted. Reduced benefit if it takes too long. So our problem statement was duplication and lack of communication and lengthy process between reviewers can cause increased trauma and reduce the effectiveness of recommendations.
Questions of clarification?
About recommendations?
Duplication and lack of communication and lengthy process between reviewers can cause increased trauma and reduce the effectiveness of recommendations. Bruce, do you have any feedback on that one? Peter?
Okay. Any objections? Rick?
Well, the only thing that I wanted to talk about the effectiveness of the recommendation. The last paragraph or half sentence was like about the effectiveness of the recommendations. And I guess it would make more sense to me if it was the effectiveness of the implementation of the recommendations. At least, I don't know, that just means a lot more to me, because that's where things actually change on the ground, is the implementation of the recommendations. I appreciate writing a good recommendation is super important, but it's the implementation that actually changes things on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Perspectives from this table?
Do we have a consensus at this table?
Debbie?
I think the comment I would make to that, and you're right, I agree with you on that, Rick, but what we were trying to say is that, we discussed this last week, is that if you make a recommendation and it takes 10 years to get there, the systems have already changed and adapted, and your recommendation may have no meaning anymore. So it wasn't really related to whether it got implemented or not.
Any other objections? Does that hold it for you, Rick?
Yep, that's good.
Okay. Sounds good. Do you want to go through the other one together? So we got one additional one to go through, and of course, we've made it through the first 5 without any objections. I'm wondering if you would like to open up the 6th issue to having a full group discussion around it, identifying what the problem is, why it's a problem, and developing the problem statement. How does the group feel? Ms. Taylor? Yeah. Perfect. So I guess we'll start with what the issue is. And I believe it's this one: ensuring all stakeholders are supported through process and advocated for their voices to be heard. So if we follow the same pattern in this process, what we'll do is we'll go popcorn style, so random, just make sure you use the mic. How do we describe this current issue, this ensuring all stakeholders are supported through the process and advocated for their voices? So describe the problem for us. Yeah, Rick?
I would say some participants in the process have more power, information, and influence than others, and they can be left behind unless there's an effort made to not leave them behind.
Okay, thank you. Yep.
I think best intentions of any group is a good beginning point, but we are often missing the point about what a voice of somebody who might not feel that they have that voice. It's so critical. So looking at youth and care to make sure that they have a true voice at every step of the way, making sure that somebody from Northern Alberta or First Nations now, person from a different location has an equal voice on every committee and is able to speak to that.
Yeah, thank you. Other perspectives, Heather?
When I see this, the problem that I see is that agencies and staff that are impacted by the death of the child may not be included in the process, and their voices won't be heard.
Other perspectives, Peter?
If I can take up on that, I see 2 parallel streams to what you're describing, Heather. So every agency that has had involvement with the child should have voice in the review process. That, I think, is one stream of what you're talking about. There's a second stream that came out 2 weeks ago when we had the roundtable with the community participants, which is how do you do the process in a way that informs the system to create change without creating harm, further harm to the family who's involved, whose case we're talking about. So it seems to me that there's this, and I think we had some conversation about this at the table, which is that there is a parallel process which is supporting the family. That's not about the investigation, it is about ensuring no further harm to the family while investigation goes on. I think there's sort of those 2 streams, I think.
Thank you. Nicole?
I think coming up with a way that supports what they actually need as opposed to what we think they need in terms of what support looks like. So asking the caregivers, asking the family themselves, what does support look like for you? Because it's different for every culture, for every individual, for every person that's dealing with it. So being direct in getting the response from the people that we will be supporting.
Thank you.
Just a sec.
Yeah, for sure.
Just to be clear, you had talked about how to see a process that informs the system while not adding or additional burden or harm to the family. Parallel process to support the family while learning through that, and then reflect and ask what does support look like to each family. So I just want to make sure I captured.
Okay, we'll go Debbie and then we'll go Rick.
And just to reinforce that, every player in that whole situation suffers trauma to some degree. There's guilt, there's, I should have done this. No matter who it is, they need support, not just the family, the workers, the law enforcement, the reviewers, everybody.
Thank you. Rick?
And to me, my impression, and what I think it's been confirmed from listening to other members' comments, are who we're talking about here are those on the government side with the lowest authority, the frontline workers, and we're talking about the families, including the children, of course, and more so those families that may not have the status, influence, power, and all that. So I think, so in both cases, we're talking about the people with the lowest level of influence and authority not being left behind.
Thank you. So that leads us to the next logical question. So why is this a problem? Nicole or Heather?
I'd say it's a problem because the voices that are the most important ones that need to be heard are often the ones that are forgotten.
Peter?
It's easy to formalize a system where you have the identified operators of the system involved in a review. It's a more complex thing to involve the voices of application to be in the review. The frontline worker, the support worker from an agency who is contracted to work with the family, and they're the harder to reach voices. And so an effective review system accesses those difficult to reach, difficult to engage voices, because you then get the reality of application in the discussion. You don't just get the high level policy, legislation, direction discussion. You get the actual, here's what it looked like when we tried to do it discussion. And that can sometimes be an information point that causes you to understand that the policy, legislation, et cetera, has a weakness to it that deserves attention. And you're going to miss that if you're not seeking to be inclusive of all of the voices that were involved in the case. That requires, by the way, that a frontline worker is able to have a conversation with, say, someone from the Child and Youth Advocate in a way that does not cause culpability.
Thank you. Lisa, just want to make sure that you're able to grab that.
Yeah, I missed the part, I got the more complex piece, I missed the easy piece. So in terms of what is the easier? So the more policy-based, procedural pieces, was that what you were saying?
The person at the upper level of the systems are easy to get involved. I'm going to poor Joni because she happens to be sitting here, but it's really easy to get Joni involved because she's got a senior policy role. It's harder to get the home care worker who acted on behalf of the case manager to get that level of involvement in the discussion.
Got it. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Patty?
I think that it's important, why this is a problem is because in all the research we see that it's hard to get to the why. Why did this worker make this decision in this context? And it's very difficult to understand that. And perhaps if we included collateral voices, then we would have an understanding of the nature of the relationship between the service providers and the client, and we may actually get to the why.
Rick?
I'm quite serious about this, but it may not sound like it for a second. I'm going to quote Mickey Mouse. Why? Because we love you. This matters because that's where the pain is, and that's where both on the side of the family and on the side of the employees. It's surely painful reading the reports. I'm sure it's more painful for those people that look that child in the eye, look that family in the eye, and for the family to look that frontline worker in the eye. That's why, if you actually want to minimize the damage, those are the people that will feel the most damage. And if you care about them, they have to be included.
Thank you. Any other perspectives from over here, why this is a problem? Debbie?
I think it's a problem if you don't support the workers, particularly the frontline ones, because that impacts their ability to continue doing their job.
Good.
Okay. Lisa, can you take us back through just one, before we get to the problem statement, just want to review the describe the problem and the why it is a problem flip charts.
So this was the issue, or you just want the whys?
The describe the problem and the why.
Okay. Okay, so describe the problem. Some participants have more power, influence, and in the system, leaving some behind. Best intentions are there. We need to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to express equally their voice and their true voice. Agencies and staff involved may not be included in the process and their voices may not be heard. Every agency whose involvement with the child should be involved in the process. How to see a process that informs a system while not adding additional harm to the families. A parallel process for supporting the families, and then further that was added on the next page, we'll get to it, to include the frontline staff as well, those that are disenfranchised in the power structures. And reflect and ask, what does the support look like for each family? And that every player suffers trauma and that they're all in need and support. That we are talking about families and frontline staff, the lowest level of influence and authority. So that was description of the issue, and for the whys, this is important. The voices that are most important are forgotten. It's easier to access the upper level individuals involved, for example, at a senior policy level. It's more complex process to involve those who implement the reality of that application and the actual practices and what they're trying to do when they're trying to do something. We will miss this if we're not inclusive of those frontline voices. In all research, it's hard to, in all the research you've heard, it's hard to get to why. If we include the collateral voices, we may get to the why. I think that's yeah.
Okay, well, there's 2 points.
Oh, sorry. Why? Because it matters. And if not supportive of frontline workers, it will impact their work.
Okay, so if we were to summarize what you just heard, so the description of the problem and the why to create a problem statement, does anyone want to give it a go in terms of bringing us that problem statement under this issue?
I can give a minute.
Heather?
Without the engagement of frontline workers and agencies, the ability to hear the voices of those impacted is minimized and therefore will impact the outcomes of any recommendation. And real change.
Okay.
Rick, you had a point?
Sorry.
Are you okay adding families in there?
Okay. So I missed the last part, so I just want to make sure. Without the engagement of frontline workers and families, the ability to hear the voice of those impacted. Sorry.
Will minimize the ability to implement recommendations and create real change.
Minimize the ability to. Sorry, minimize the ability to
Implement
thank you.
recommendations and create real change.
Jason?
I like all that. I wonder if we should say frontline workers, families, and communities. To try to get something broadly in there, but,
I will accept that friendly amendment.
well, it's the first time I had a friendly amendment passed since I've been elected.
It's a big collaboration.
All right, so what I'm hearing, though, is there seems to be consensus in terms of the problem statement around this issue being without engagement of frontline workers, families, and communities, the ability to hear voices of those impacted will minimize the ability to implement recommendations and create real change. We're good going forward with that? Okay, so at this point, what I want to do is I want to read out again the problem statements, and I want to just have a quick conversation around that. So Heather, if you can read out your problem statements again off of the sheet. Cameron's going to do it? All right.
Do you want me to read the issue?
If you just read the problem statement, that's fine.
Duplication, lack of communication, lengthy process between reviews can cause increased trauma and reduce the effectiveness of recommendations.
Yep.
Recommendations seem to be representative of all Albertans, which minimizes or ignores cultural experience of families, imposing solutions that recipient is unable to implement. And the public perceives government is hiding information to avoid accountability. However, what is the balance between protecting families and the right to know, supporting the family to understand the implications of the publication ban?
Okay, Patty, can you read the problem statements you came up with?
Unmandated groups are doing overlapping work in silos without an accountability framework. Further, the stat director has too much power to determine whether external investigations happen.
And then, of course, the last one, without engagement of frontline workers and families and communities, the ability to hear voices of those impacted will minimize the ability to implement recommendations and create real change. So when you were listening to those problem statements, I want to know what did you hear? What was jumping out at you as you listened to those problem statements? Pardon? Can you say it in the mic?
Overlap.
Thank you. Overlap. What else were we hearing? Gaps? Heather?
It's social work week, so I'm going to do it social worky. It's a power over relationship, not a power with relationship.
Ooh.
I knew you'd get it.
Peter?
Necessity for inclusiveness.
Debbie?
David's comment about gaps got me thinking that there's also a gap, and I don't know how to word it, but illustrate it. There's a gap with the review being done up here when it should be done down here.
What else did we hear? What else was jumping out at us? We think about those problem statements. So far we've heard overlap, we've heard there's gaps between where the review place is, we have the power over relationship, not with the necessity for inclusiveness. What else is jumping out at us?
Making decisions based on a meaningful voice.
Mm-hmm.
I missed the last part.
Making decisions based on meaningful voice.
Okay.
Peter?
Timeliness.
Timeliness. And that's timeliness in terms of how long a review takes, or?
I think it comes back to the point that Heather was making, that it's timeliness of the review and its conclusions, and then timeliness of implementation and monitoring of implementation.
Okay. So the next question I have for you, if we were able to take these problem statements and we create recommendations that help solve these problem statements, what impact do you think we would be able to have based on the statements you heard here tonight? So what potential impact could we make if we solve these issues? Greg?
I mean, in terms of impact, I would hope the impact is that fewer children die in care.
Mm-hmm.
Period. And there's a bunch of, obviously, process that flows upstream from that.
Mm-hmm.
But that really ought to be our laser focus on what we're trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm. Rick?
Yeah, more public confidence and a system that could be more conducive to ongoing improvement.
Okay, thank you. Jason, did you have one?
I think there would be, we would establish some trust in the process with the public.
How about over here? What impact do you think if we address these problems, what impact do you think we'd have? Maria, did you have something?
No.
Right now I'm hearing fewer children die in care, more public confidence, more conducive system open to ongoing improvement, establish trust and process with public. Is there any other impacts we think we would make? Peter?
Acceptance by the public that the system is imperfect but accountable.
Imperfect but accountable. Greg?
That we take a step forward on a path to reconciliation.
Nicole?
A better process.
A better process. Heather, do you have a point?
I think a minimization of the duplication. Or a decrease in duplication. Efficiency. And an approach across all ministries with better communication.
Patty?
Maybe a depoliticized process. It would, if this was worked out, that it wouldn't have to be in the political arena. It could be outside of that.
So at this point in time, we've worked our way through, we found common ground on 6 issues, and we've really worked to understand the characteristics of those issues. We've defined what we see as the problems within those issues and why we see it as a problem. And we've ultimately come down to problem statements. So problem statements can be used to then think about how do I solve these problems. So they're ultimately the questions or the statements that enable you to think about the problem-solving piece, so the recommendation piece of our process. The question I would ask at this point in time is we've talked about the duplication and the cross-ministry collaboration, multidisciplinary approaches, lots of those things. What are maybe just, and this is just an entry point into that conversation, it's not something we'll reconcile tonight fully, but what are some of the issues within the child death review process that we haven't necessarily talked about yet? What are some of the issues that we still need to flag and address before we move forward? Peter?
I think it follows from the discussion that we've been having, but it is a structure of true independence reporting to the legislature in a mechanism that ensures follow-up on recommendations, transparency, and clear avenues of accountability.
Thank you. Just want to make sure, Lisa, you were able to capture
I missed them. A structure of true independence to the legislature. There were 3 things you said there. Clear accountability. Did I miss?
Sorry. It's getting late. You want me to remember that?
Yeah.
What did I say, Heather?
We do have a recorder in the room.
Yeah, we have a recorder, so we'll make sure
Yeah.
that we add check recording. Thank you.
Yep.
Ensuring a distinction between different types of fatality.
Distinction between different types of fatality.
Okay. So distinguishing between a fatality as a result of child abuse and neglect versus medically fragile children versus somebody or a population that is committing suicide.
Keep the mic closer to you.
Population committing suicide at a much higher rate than it should be. They're all really different substantive things. So I think we need to continue to focus on that.
Okay, thank you. Greg?
Bruce, Is it as simple as saying preventable versus non-preventable deaths, or is it? And even within preventable, we can subcategorize. Some is abuse and neglect, some is suicide. Is that fair?
I'd say preventable versus non-preventable, but I'd also say focusing on age groups, focusing on reasons for fatality. Because, again, they're really different things if you're trying to retool a system to intervene in a different way with young children 0 to 5 years age versus kids that are 15 and 17 that have had 15 years of experience that have just been horrible, right? So really different things to focus on.
Patty?
I would still like to talk about the publication ban not being, families not having to go to court to pursue that, to make this easier to deal with for families who would like to pursue a publication ban. And I have one more.
Yep.
We haven't really talked about the well-being of staff. And I would like to say not only ministry staff, but the staff of the service providers in this process around things like ongoing training, things like just thinking about the well-being of staff in the death review process. And not just ministry staff. There are a lot of people who are staff that work with children who pass, and in this process, we really have to be mindful of them as well.
Thank you.
And there's going to be Indigenous staff who have their own history of grief and loss, and this is going to be another loss in their life, and that has to be, we need to think about that.
Thank you.
And in relation to that, the reputed culture of fear and blame. Changing the culture of fear and blame.
Just for clarification, where does that culture live? Where does it exist? Is it across the whole? Is it in pockets? Where are you seeing that?
I don't have a lot of personal experience, but the review that was done in 2014 identified the difficulty of frontline workers not feeling blamed when things go wrong. And if management is not conscious or concerned about a culture in which frontline folks feel blamed, then information doesn't get shared. Appropriate information doesn't get shared.
Thank you for that. Peter?
Well, I'd like to tackle the elephant in the room, and that is that 0 deaths will not occur. So really, I think what we're trying to say is that death should be preventable to the extent possible, and when death does occur, no death should go without having learned something from it so that the mistakes aren't repeated. But we're not going to hit 0 because we cannot with certainty predict who will do harm to a child. But what we can predict is patterns of behaviors that we can be preventative with.
Thank you. All right, final thoughts on issues that we have yet to talk about. Graham?
I think it's about providing the tools for frontline workers and those involved in the system to be more proactive than reactive.
Heather?
This could potentially be stage 2. But I think it's having a conversation around the public awareness campaigns and education that can be done to prevent children from coming into care. So not just about safe sleep that we've talked about already while we've been here, but talking about like I mean, an example I would think of would be like the FASD or fetal alcohol effect, information that's being shared to try to prevent children from being impacted by in vitro exposure to alcohol. But I mean, there's many other things that maybe in stage 2 we can talk about how to look at some of the social determinants of health to try to minimize kids coming into care.
All right. So as I said, we're not going to be able to fully reconcile these, but we want to get them out here because ultimately we do want to go through another iteration and make sure that we have captured all the issues so that we can form the best recommendations. So we do have a couple things. One, of course, we'll facilitate a brief process on the 16th to further refine to further move through the process and refine issues as we're seeing them. Again, that's on the 16th. But the other piece, as I alluded to earlier, is if we are going to get to recommendations and we're going to spend the bulk majority of the meeting on the 30th trying to form recommendations and get to consensus, we need to start thinking about population or generation of options. So Lisa's going to facilitate a great process on the 30th, but in order for her to facilitate that process, she needs some information that is gathered and is thought about and that is giving you time to also walk away and reflect on some of the things you've been hearing and some of the recommendations that you would like to put forward. So we've put together a little bit of a worksheet that we're going to ask you to work on. Basically, you're identifying what the key issue is that you're addressing, what the recommendation you would make is, and what's the rationale behind that recommendation. And we have slots for multiple recommendations to be made in this worksheet. But if you can populate this and send this to the Secretariat, it'll go by March 24th. It'll go a long way in the meeting on March 30th into finding those areas of consensus around what recommendations we feel ultimately will have the most impact on the child death review process. So I'll give some of these to Lisa and I'll hand out some of these to this table. But if you could please complete this again by March 24th, it would go a long way.
And so just to clarify, this hard copy version is just to provide you with an overview of what that worksheet looks like, and you'll receive the electronic version through the Secretariat. So the boxes can expand and you can include the content that you need to include in there. But we wanted you to just have a look at it and just see the structure of it this evening. So.
Yeah, absolutely. The other, I guess, last thing I would say is certainly we've come a long way in already refining the issues in the short amount of time we've had together. But certainly we have a long way left to go in terms of getting through this process. So I thank you for your ongoing engagement and your ongoing work throughout this process as we work to craft the recommendations. At this moment in time, as I said in the last one, we always like to tie a bow at the end of these sessions. So I just want to give you 1 minute to really think about, what are some of the takeaways or maybe something you learned here today that you can take forward to our next meeting here on the 16th. So I'll just give you a minute to reflect and then I'll ask if there's anybody who would like to share. Does anybody like to share a learning or a takeaway that you can take from today's meeting and bring forward to the meeting on the 16th? Maria?
For me, I'm taking away that we need to get away from a culture of blame and move to a culture of fixing what's wrong.
Debbie, you're holding the mic.
I guess I'd like to reinforce what Peter said. We're not going to solve the problem of children dying in care, but we are going to hopefully, be able to find more effective ways to do the most that we possibly can to prevent it.
Any other learnings, takeaways we'd like to share today? Patty?
We are talking about children dying in care. I also hope that, and it's not just about reducing serious injuries also, but I feel like I'm hoping we'll get to the point of better quality of care and more content children who can flourish rather than survive a system. I hope that for me, this is what's coming up, is that it's critical that we look at children who pass and who sustain serious injury. I really hope we get to the point of talking about flourishing and children who do well and are well-adjusted and happy and come out of the system feeling served rather than harmed.
Absolutely. All right. On that note, I'll pass it over to Lisa.
Sorry, just a point of clarification in case you're wondering, all of the notes and summaries will be provided to you through the Secretariat, as well as the content that you wrote on your problem statement worksheet, so that you have the benefit of all of that information to help you in your thinking for your forming your individual recommendations and using that template. So just if you were wondering about that, that's what we will provide through the Secretariat from the evening.
With that, thanks again for your participation tonight, and I'll turn it back over to our chair.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate your work, Damien and Lisa. And again, I also want to thank all the panel members for their contribution and their hard work and your commitment to doing this homework. It's going to be essential to allowing us to maximize our time ahead, because we don't have a lot of time and we've got a lot of work yet to do. So appreciate that. We're still trying to confirm the next meeting agenda. We've invited First Nations delegates from Treaties 6, 7, and 8 to share their experience, knowledge, and cultural perspective on the child death review process. And we're going to continue to move forward working towards finding some concrete and meaningful recommendations to improve the child death review process and consider the impacts on families and communities. And again, we've talked about earlier, with the goal of coming up with some legislation that will encapsulate the discussion that we've had. However, I do have to contradict a little bit of what Damien said about our next meeting. We have realized, of course, Budget Day is March 16th, which creates some problems for many of us. They tried to move the meeting to March 15th, but the treaties can't do that. So we've got two possible options that we could make work. We could still go ahead with Budget Day, but tweak the time so we go from 8 till noon and then 5 till 7. Now, I appreciate that's going to be tight for people, but that would be one. We would have presentations from the Indigenous groups both morning and afternoon, and we would have no facilitated session at all. Or we would do Monday, March 20th, morning 8:30 to 12:30, 3:30 to 5:30. And again, those would both just be presentations without the facilitated session, so sorry, guys. So if I could get a sense, it's really important tonight to get a sense of where people are at. If neither of those work, then we have to completely redo our poll for the following week, and we would have to have an answer back tonight as well. So if there's any way everybody could make one of these options work, that would be our ideal. Okay, so it would be March on the 20th. It would be between 8:30 and 12:30, and then 3:30 to 5:30. Okay, how many say Budget Day is impossible, March 16th? Okay, and how many say March 20th is impossible? Is not possible. Okay. How many can't do March 16th, Budget Day? They say it's impossible. Okay, and how many say March 20th is impossible? I know, I did it reversed. It's the consensus model. It's messing me up, right?
I just want to say, like, in fairness to our members from the opposition, the 16th is probably a really rough day, and they have lots of things that they need to do that day. And I know that I have lots of things to do that day. So I'm just thinking that because it is a budget, like that's a busy day for everybody with stakeholders coming and all those different people that are going to be there, that the 20th would be ideal compared to doing it on budget.
I didn't run this by the people who are helping organize this. Is a possibility of splitting them? Do the morning of budget day and the morning of March 20th? That wouldn't work? That's worse? Okay. Just thought I'd toss it out there.
Yeah, I don't know about my other, I mean, we do have 3 party leaders on this committee, so it does make it tough. But until we go into the embargoed briefing on budget, which is what, 1 o'clock, 1:30? There's actually not, I mean, beyond being in the House on that morning, because it's a sitting day, there's not, I mean, I don't know, maybe you guys are caucusing, and I don't know. I could possibly make the 16th work. It's not the absolute end of the world, but I don't know. I'm speaking for myself anyway. I don't know how it's like for David or the other guys.
My bigger concern than just us is whether or not it will be, if we can do the process justice. Quite frankly, the government's going to be busy too. It's not just the opposition is going to be busy. It's going to be chaos. There's going to be guests here for the budget. My concern is about doing the process justice. You're going to have people running in and out nonstop. That's my bigger concern than our time. I'll make whatever work. I know my colleagues will as well, but we all know what budget days like around here.
Well, and I take the point that the brains are going to be elsewhere too. It makes it hard to focus. How about Friday, March 17th? Is that a possibility for anybody? Yes.
I got to be in Sundry by 4 to give a speech. So 3 hours.
Okay, how about, how about instead of trying to decide this right this second, let's give everybody the hour transition getting home and then resolve that we'll all get back tonight to the Secretariat with a final date? Would you like to do a poll? I think we could do tomorrow at 10 a.m. It's just, we're concerned about the Indigenous groups that we have to invite. Go ahead.
Well, Madam Chair, I'll try and see if I can get somebody to teach my class on the 20th. That seems to work for everybody else, so I'm going to put out some emails tonight and see if I can get somebody to take my class on the 20th.
Okay, that would be awesome, Peter.
The tough thing is I'd have to miss faculty council, which is sort of like having to sit, in a painful immunization. So, but I'll try and get someone to teach my.
So it's a mixed blessing.
As soon as I hear back, I'll.
Okay. Okay, appreciate that. So then let's lean towards March 20th because that seems to be much better overall for everybody. And if anything drastically changes, we'll let you know before 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. Sound good? Do we have consensus? Okay, and I do have one additional issue to raise very quickly, is the issue of having frontline staff present. We have been in touch with a representative of the union, and they've made a request for an individual to present to the panel in camera. Their experience with the child death review involves staff who they work with, and they would like to avoid public discussion of the case so as to protect the mental health of the staff who are involved. I believe this is a reasonable request, and it falls within the guidelines of the in-camera process we discussed, but I just wanted to get some sense from the group, how they felt about it. Everybody's good with that? This does raise another issue, and it's the staff authorization. So we're working on this, and we're trying to get a form done. And over the next couple of days, I'll be in touch with everybody to get some feedback on what that authorization is going to be like.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
No concern for myself, but I think it might be good to define what in-camera is going to mean for that. So is that just panel, or is it the department, and us? What does that mean? And I'm fine with it.
I have to go back to our discussion on in-camera, how we defined that. I think we had defined it was just panel. But yes, Cheryl? Okay. That's good then? Okay, I think that being said, I don't think there's anything further. Anybody has any other closing remarks? I'll let you go home, get started on your homework. Thank you, everybody. Good night.